Welcome to Abstracts. This week, human experimentation.
These are all identical twins used for medical experiment. Hundreds of twins from all over Europe were brought to this camp. They were numbered, but their origin and even their names are unknown.
There is no doubt that Hirt and Bruno Beger wanted to exploit the enormous potential provided by Auschwitz. Here they had access to what they termed human material, Jews from all across Europe.
The experiments began in a prisoner of war camp in Manchuria in 1942. The Japanese scientists used chemical sprays, injections, blood samples, and rectal smears.
They were, bodies were put up on autopsy tables, and then they would cut them open and so forth to get their organs.
是在感染了梅毒菌的中国女性身上。
I did vivisections at the time. The experiment was conducted on a living Chinese woman who was infected with syphilis. She was sleeping. Because she was alive, the blood poured out just like water from a tap. I have no courage to record things like this now. They would wake up from anesthesia and cry out, "Don't hurt my children." I cannot forget these things ever.
So, hello, welcome to Abstracts. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Andy.
Very good to see you. It's
Yeah,
been a
you too.
while.
Has
It's
been a
a
little
while
while.
since we did this.
About 3 weeks, hasn't it been?
About 3 weeks. About 3 weeks, hasn't it been, sir? Hasn't it been, Governor?
All right,
Yeah.
mate. I'll talk like this for the rest of it then.
Yes, it has indeed. We had a little break, but we deserved a break, quite frankly, I think.
Yes, very busy.
But we've got something quite cool to do. Well, not cool.
Well, cool's the wrong word, isn't it?
Cool is the wrong word.
Yeah.
Everything was decidedly uncool.
Everything was decidedly dark, depressing, and actually, I've honestly found this one of the most difficult ones to research. Not out of difficulty of finding the research, but of just dealing with it and reading it. On one day, I thought I had food poisoning, and I
Really?
think it was just disgust.
Yeah, it isn't nice stuff. It's definitely not for the squeamish. If we laugh during it, it's purely because it's so horrific. We don't know what else to do. But there are some pretty horrible things. So if you are squeamish, we apologise. We're talking about basically human experimentation.
Yes, experimentation, abuses of experimentation. I mean, you'd call it bioethics.
Yeah.
Right, so ethical abuses. There's kind of two sides to this. There's the boring side and there's the horrific side. We're going to be talking largely about the horrific side. So the horrific side is all of these abuses that took place throughout history. Well, not all of them, but we'll select a few. And then the boring side of that is there's all these codes of conduct that come as a result of that. So there's the Nuremberg Code, there's the Declaration of Helsinki. A lot of these things came around and about because of these abuses. So this is kind of a two parts, as in there's two parts to this. We'll only talk about the abuses. We won't bore you with the legislative stuff that came after it.
In a way, it's just like we have laws because people do bad things to each other. Now we have ethical codes of conduct because research was unethical for a very, very long period of time.
Yeah.
Most of the 20th century, actually.
Yeah. And there was a little bit of a part in the middle that you might know about where it went really, really deeply, darkly wrong.
Really darkly wrong. But to begin with, before we start going into the really dark, systematic kind of stuff.
Abuse of human beings.
Yeah, real abuse of human beings. I'd like to start with something that's just really quite mad. And that by today's standards, you'd think it was just mad. You'd just laugh this person out of what they were thinking. But back in the 1920s, this was not so crazy. So have you heard of a guy called Ilya Ivanov?
I haven't, no.
Right, so I think he was a geneticist. He was more or less a geneticist, and he got big by through his work in artificial insemination. He had success crossbreeding various species and things like that. And he wanted to continue his work. But his big plan was to cross a human with an ape of some kind. And this wasn't controversial. It wasn't a controversial idea. It wasn't controversial in Europe. It wasn't really controversial anywhere. In fact, he got a lot of support from the scientific community for this ideas. At that time, there's this big drive towards like atheism, in a way. Atheists are really becoming quite prominent. So there was a lot to be gained from Ivanov's research from the atheists, and kind of the public were in a state where they wanted to know whether or not it was categorical that humans evolved from apes, or if people who said that were actually committing some vile sin. They wanted, it was either God or we either evolved, and kind of that's what was going on politically all over the world.
Okay.
Ivanov himself, his motivations for doing it aren't clear, but it's all the other politics around him that kind of support the work. It was supported in Russia by intellectuals, top politicians, and it was kind of pushed through by radicalists within the Russian government who had real futurist aspirations. They kind of wanted to really take over. It was supported by another guy as well called Nikolai Gorbanov. Have you heard of this dude?
Ah, yes.
Yeah, he was a chemical engineer, dead close with Lenin and Trotsky. He was a Trotsky supporter, all these people.
Okay.
And so to begin is his experimentation crossing humans with apes. He wanted to lead a research expedition to West Africa. And this was supported by the French because Ivanov had been trained in France.
Okay.
Done a lot of work in France, and he was supported by the French and also the Russians. By the Russians, he was supported because they wanted to bring chimpanzees back to Russia to further these insemination experiments, etc. But his first was going to be in West Africa, in French Guinea. And so originally what he wanted to do was he wanted to pay local women in dollars to inseminate them with chimpanzee sperm.
Oh my God.
So that's what he wanted to do. Local women are like, no. There's no way you're going to do. I think he quite underestimated.
So he informed them. He told them it's informed consent he was looking for.
That was his plan. He wanted to pay them, and they were like, no, we're not going to get inseminated by chimpanzees. But the thing was, he kept getting more and more into this idea, because when he first landed in French New Guinea, he was told stories by the locals that sometimes chimpanzees would come down into the town and rape the women.
Oh.
So he was bolstered by this kind of idea, if he indeed ever heard that idea. He could have just made up.
But that's what he maybe said afterwards.
Yeah,
okay.
Totally. The local women wouldn't let them pay him to inseminate them with chimpanzee sperm, so he inseminated female chimpanzees with human sperm. And the sperm was most likely from his son, who he was travelling with.
What?
He travelled with his son. Yeah.
What on earth?
He travelled with his son, and he travelled with a slave, really. And then he got the idea that he wanted to inseminate the local women without their knowledge.
Oh.
So he was like, right, so under the guise of a medical examination, I'll just inseminate. Stick in a little bit of sperm.
Is this a gynecological examination? or is he like, okay, I'm just going to, wrap your arm up and I'm going to, here's an injection, also pants down. What does it specify how he did that? Or
it didn't specify because he never did it, right?
Oh, he never did it?
He never did it. And the reason he never did he never did it because he went, basically the French mayor or the guy, the French governor of French New Guinea at the time was like, no. As well, he was like, no, you're not just inseminating women with chimpanzee sperm without their consent.
Yeah.
Right?
No shits.
So Ivanov, this pisses him off. It basically pisses him off. And he writes a letter to the Russians.
Well, of course, he's given up his own son for this. He's given everything, and now they're telling him no.
This is it.
Oh, my
This is
God.
doing his head in.
Okay, sorry. Carry on.
So he writes a letter. He writes a letter to the Russians going, these crazy locals and these bourgeois French, right? They're just they're not letting me do it. I want to do this, I want to do that. So the Russians hold a committee. They hold a committee.
Yeah.
And even they are like, no. If you're going to inseminate women, you need to get consent, blah, blah, blah. So that's why you
and when this is the 20s?
This is 1920s.
Okay, so that's fairly forward-thinking in terms of the sort of ethics of the time.
This is it.
Consent wasn't always sought, so...
No.
So the institutions were doing their job at this point.
At that point, yeah, absolutely. But what's kind of interesting is obviously the man was not successful, but what is kind of interesting about this and how it does come into the politics is where it was supported from. So obviously it was supported by Bolsheviks in Russia for reasons that we'll get onto later, but it also got support from the United States in the form of the Atheist Association.
Really?
So there was a dude called Howell S. English, and he gave this speech on behalf of the Atheist Organization supporting Ivanov's work. He said that this work would prove evolution.
And he knew that it was going to be cross-species insemination.
Well, yeah, because he was really kind of influenced by this dude called Herman Klatch.
Okay.
who was a German anthropologist who had what was called a polyphyletic theory. And the polyphyletic theory was that certain human beings descended from certain apes.
Okay.
So if you'll excuse the obvious racism here, he basically says that yellow-raced people descended from orangutans. He said that black people descended from gorillas. He said that white people descended from chimpanzees. And he said that Jews descended from gibbons.
Okay.
He didn't outrightly say Jews, but it's implied that he did because he makes mention of what's called the brachycephalic people, right?
Okay.
Brachycephalic was kind of an anti-Semitic slur, saying that they have different nose structures. They're basically Eastern European Jews or Ashkenazi Jews are different than the biblical Jews. They're like weird. So it was like part anti-Semitic propaganda to say that we're descended from gibbons.
Did he start ranking them? Because at the moment you kind of go, well, at least he recognises we all come from apes.
Yeah, no, but he was saying that yellow race people come from orangutans. This is Klatch. This is the polyphyletic theory.
And he was
from
like,
Klatch.
the colours are similar.
Right, so
Jesus Christ.
Howell jumps on this
Okay.
from the Atheist Association. So in 26, Ivanov's assistant distanced himself from this kind of work. He was saying it basically confirmed the scale of this operation because they were doing it like loads and loads and loads.
Yeah.
But out of the chimpanzees that were brought to Russia, only 4 of them survived. So he couldn't really get on with doing his work because he brought all these apes over, but so many of them died. Almost all of them died. Only 4 chimpanzees survived out of 20.
Oh, really?
And he had to build like a special premises, like a primate nursery and things like that. His work in 1927 was reviewed by academies of sciences. Now, scientific people in Russia were like, this is just stupid. What are you doing? But then the new Russians, these new reformists, these like kind of Bolsheviks, the growing in that, they were like, no. We almost want to create this new socialist man.
Okay.
So it had like this kind of stuff.
Yep.
So as a result, they got more money from the Communist Academy, which had then split into the Academy of Sciences. It called itself the Academy of Sciences. And the idea was that what it had to do was to get 5 Soviet women to agree to the experiment with written consent.
Okay. Well, given the size of Russia, I'm sure you can find 5.
And they did. But none of these women were going to be paid because, of course, they just had to have a special interest in science
Okay.
to do it. They found the women, but by the time that they found the women, all the chimpanzees were dead.
Well, thank God for that.
And they only had 1 orangutan, but unfortunately, no yellow-raced people to try and test them on. More chimps arrived apparently in 1930. They got more over, but Ivanov himself was arrested in December 1930 for his support of the international bourgeoisie and was exiled to Kazakhstan and died 2 years later in a camp.
God, there you go. That's serendipity, isn't it? That's very lucky.
Propped up and supported by the Russian government and then sent away to Kazakhstan to die because he was too bourgeois.
Wow.
Which is fully nuts. Really, what was the Russian thing? So the Bolsheviks, what they wanted to do was this thing. They'd become interested in this thing called rejuvenation surgery, which was pioneered by this dude called Sergei Voronov, where he took male chimps, he took the sex glands, and he implanted them into men's bodies.
Oh no, I've heard about this.
And what it was supposed to do, it was supposed to result in improved sight, lower blood pressure, new hair growth, and your muscles regain like strength or whatever. And this is the idea for this new kind of man that you can rejuvenate. So the new Soviet man is basically a combination of positive eugenics and artificial insemination with state-controlled psychological changes. So in crossing apes with humans was just an extension of that work. You couldn't really carry on with this rejuvenation surgery because getting chimps into Europe was really expensive. Setting up like monkey estates was really expensive, but this Voronov guy had one. And so Ivanov went to Voronov very often, and what they actually managed to do was they transplanted some women's ovaries into a female chimpanzee called Nora, and they inseminated Nora with human sperm.
And this worked? They didn't reject it? The body didn't reject it? It works?
Oh no, Nora died.
I mean, I want to say thank God, but...
Of course she died. But the idea was that through this eugenics process, through Ivanov's eugenics insemination process, it would remove love from reproduction. because in the Bolshevik ideology, love held humanity back.
This is very Brave New World, very Huxley.
Super crazy. And there was another Russian guy called Serabovsky. He was a Russian eugenicist as well, and he believed that it would end the bourgeois institute of the family.
Yeah.
So no evolution, no nothing like that. Like the family is just a bourgeois construction.
So that is Brave New World, where everyone's an
Yeah.
individual. It's really weird. I mean, if you haven't read it, anyone listening, read it, because everyone talks about 1984, but that's very communist state future, whereas Brave New World is almost more accurate. You know, where sex has become a big part of the culture. Individualism is prized, but that is it. They break down the family. No one has mothers and fathers. Everyone is basically bred in a test tube and genetically modified. And actually, they start genetically modifying people or genetically breeding them so that they hit the gin, which we haven't spoken about yet, has already taken effect.
We're going to get into
but
that.
Yeah, they're genetically bred to be part of a certain class. And yeah, so everyone's an individual. Everybody is genetically engineered. That's exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it was, the new Soviet man.
Wow.
So that's all of what I've just said is covered in a really, really good article. It's called Beyond Eugenics, The Forgotten Scandal of Hybridizing Humans and Apes. It's by a guy called Alexander Etkind, who's a historian.
Right.
And it's absolutely a fantastic article. It goes into well more detail. But I just thought that was a really funny, crazy story to kind of wet our beaks a little bit.
Yeah, well, before we get into the real abuses.
The real abuses, yeah.
Which actually, I mean, it's difficult because you want to kind of address these things with a certain amount of sensitivity, of course. But like you've already said, you know, we probably will laugh simply out of... I mean, when I start talking about, you know, the removal of testicles, we're going to be squeamish. We're going to... But, yeah... let's say we've wet our beaks.
It's a coping mechanism. It's a coping mechanism for what's going to come. But before we do get into the deep and the heavy stuff, should we talk about the gin we're drinking?
Yeah,
Matthew?
absolutely. So Lone Wolf,
Cloudy
Lemon gin,
Brewdog.
Brewdog.
This is from the Brewdog Distilling Company, a Scottish company.
Aberdeenshire, in fact.
I remember when Brewdog first opened. I lived in Edinburgh at the time. They opened an establishment on the Cowgate.
Okay.
And there was just this one, and it was like super cool, Brewdog all over Edinburgh. And then it's just the open one in London. It's massive.
It's huge now.
Brewdog is huge. I think there's one in Manchester, all over the shop.
Yeah,
and now they do gin, apparently.
Yeah, so apparently, you know, although it's one of the most recent gins to hit the market, along with Adnams is now doing distilling as well. This is part of a huge operation. You know, obviously a huge brewing operation. So apparently it's the biggest, or it looks like the biggest when you turn up to the distillery, the biggest operation in terms of the new distillers. But yeah, Cloudy Lemon gin. Apparently it's steeped in lemon peel.
It is nice.
Yeah, we're serving
smooth.
it with lemon. So it's very lemony, very smooth. Because one thing I said to you before we opened it, I said I've had a lot of orange gins. Or clementine gins.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're quite sharp.
Yeah, they are. They can be a bit just tart sometimes.
Yeah, but this really hasn't given me the same effect.
No, not at all. And it's that citrus is really cutting out the booziness that we got with the Roku last time.
Yes. Yeah.
Was it Roku?
It's Roku gin. Yeah.
And because that was really, you could really taste the vodka base in that. But with this one, it's a super cloudy gin as well itself. Yeah, really nice.
Really cloudy. I've got to say, the Roku gin, I've been testing that thoroughly since the last podcast.
With plenty of ginger, I hope.
Although people look at you a bit weirdly. You go to a bar and they say, "What would you like in it?" You say, "Have you got a ginger?" And they look at you like you're from another, well, not from another planet. I guess.
Well, yeah, because they've not pre-chopped that, Matthew. Have you ever worked in a bar?
No.
Right, so after having worked in a bar, if some dickhead comes up to you and says, "I want a gin with," "Oh, have you got a slice of ginger?" It's, no, I've got lemon, lime. That'll do.
Yeah, they have to go get the cucumber from the restaurant. I've had that. Like, how dare you? Yeah, I'm that guy now. Have you got any ginger to go with it? Well, that's a Japanese gin and tonic, actually. Oh, God, get out. Yeah, I know. They're probably spitting in it. I think, it's so pearlescent. There's something floating in it. God, that's so fancy, isn't it?
Not brown, I hope. It wasn't brown.
No, never.
Never bits.
But yeah, very nice gin.
And a fantastic bottle. It's got a very nice design. The design of the wolf on the front, the lone wolf itself, does look like a tattoo, a chest tattoo a UFC fighter might have.
It does, yeah. The sort of thing you have right in the centre of your chest.
Yeah, big chest piece. It's nice. Yeah, no, but it's good. I'm happy with it so far. I'm sure it'll stand us in good stead. And it's good to
Well, it's already
have a little taste of home, a little taste of the north.
Well, absolutely. I'm half Scottish.
As am I, the best half.
The best half. The tougher half.
Yeah, exactly. The real half.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so that's what's already having an effect on my speech.
Absolutely. Me too, actually. It's pretty good. It's very good.
It's very nice.
Very nice. Lone wolf, ladies and gentlemen. Lone wolf. So shall we get into it? Let's get into it, man.
Yeah. So
now we've covered Ivanov, apes, and some of the mentality of the early 1920s in Russia.
Yeah. What happened after that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're going to go on to talk about the Nazis, and we're going to talk about the Japanese and what's called Unit 731 as well, because they got up to a few bits and pieces as well. However, I've been speaking to a lot of people, and they don't even realise that Japan was part of the Axis powers. They didn't realise that Japan was part of the Second World War. Anyone who already knows this might think, well, obviously, what's happened to the education system? But some people just don't know this. Well, it's true because, I mean, maybe I know this more than others because my grandfather actually served and fought the Japanese in the Second World War. So to me, it was almost obvious. He was in Burma, which is now, I believe, Myanmar, and he was out there in the jungle with the Chindits fighting the Japanese. But, yeah, so what unites the Japanese on the other side of the world? Italy, which was another power in the Axis alliance, and then also Germany. So very quickly, before we get into what went on, it's probably worth saying what united them. And so actually, at that time, pre-World War II, there was this idea that they were the outsiders. So you had this language of the haves and the have-nots. So you got to remember, at that time, you still had, the British Empire, or the legacy of the British Empire, along with the French Empire. You have the US as a power. And
we were all over Asia.
We were all over Asia. We were all over Africa, as were the French predominantly. And they felt that it was unfair. It was unfair that we had plundered the world before they had. And they felt that actually they started framing it as national survival. So Germany, Japan, Italy all felt that they should, in an effort to save their nation, also go on a total war effort and start preparing for imperialism. And actually, in some papers, they've called this fascist imperialism. So they start preparing. And if you think about Japan specifically, they had this idea of Asianism, which is very comparable to Aryanism. So we get taught in school about Aryanism and, the white-haired or the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan, the
ideal,
Nazis.
The Übermensch, right?
The Übermensch, yeah. You take the sort of the Nietzschean idea of the Superman almost.
And distort it.
Yeah, and the Asians, or I should say the Japanese, had this same concept. And they had this other concept of just being hyper-military or hyper-militaristic. And they were also terrified of the communists, which sets the scene for what then happens. So they had this Red Peril. And this all gets kind of wrapped up in this radical statism, where they essentially look to the state to answer all of these problems. They were looking at the rise of France and Britain as global powers, and they looked to the state to answer these ills. And actually, I was thinking, if you think back to our Brexit episode, we talked about the Lockean exclamation, which is the idea that don't tell me what I can't do. The idea that you value control. There's a contrast to that as well, which is the Madisonian, or the James Madison, who talks about republics. The Madisonian exclamation, which is one where you go, you deal with it. And there's this idea, it's almost like two at once. It's like, don't tell us what we can't do. We're going to take over the world as well. We're going to be an imperial power. But also, on an individual level, people were going, you deal with it. The state can deal with it.
I find that happening a lot now as well.
Yes.
There's a lot of problems, but nobody wants to personally deal with it. We'd rather externalise it.
Well, the terrifying thing is that this was framed as a need for equality. Now, you might look back and go, well, you can't just say that just because you guys have empires, equality means that we should have empires too. But that was how it was being framed at the time. This idea of national survival.
Equality for all peoples?
No, that's where we have a slightly different idea now. but it was being framed as equality. It was being framed as, we need to be on an equal footing. It's very unfair, and they wanted the state to give them that equality. It's not totally dissimilar to today. Now, it is a bit different. We've had civil rights movements since then. Like you say, it's all about equality for all people. But it's interesting how this started from almost... I think the fundamental premise was wrong, which was that we should also have an empire.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But from that one fundamentally incorrect, in my opinion, premise, equality and looking to the state for answers took them to Asianism and Aryanism. You had fascist imperialism.
So are we talking about Japan as thinking they're just vastly superior to other Asian countries?
Yes. And you've got to think they're right next to China as well. China is a communist country, so they were not particularly happy with their neighbours either. And they actually took over, as you'll go on to talk about, they took over Manchuria, which is the northeastern part of China. And the way they did that, the army essentially just took control. So if we talk about Japan first and the Nazis second, with Japan, the army staged an explosion on the Japanese railway track in Manchuria, because they had control of some of the railway tracks in northeastern China at the time, and they just went on this bombing campaign. So it was essentially a conspiracy. They made it look like the Chinese was attacking them, and then the Japanese just flooded northeastern China with their troops. And they also then started assassinating people in Tokyo. So the army started assassinating like the finance minister, and eventually it led to, after a few attempts, they essentially tried a coup d'etat where they assassinated the prime minister, and they seized control of central Tokyo. Eventually, the rebel faction was defeated, but somehow the army had managed to fund the media so much so that, okay, there was a coup d'etat and they were defeated and there were the rebels. However, Manchuria was largely seen as a positive thing, right? So it was meant to be essentially an idea of, well, this is the future of Japan. This is our imperial ambitions being fulfilled.
That's right.
And they took and maintained it. And somehow they managed to get the other politicians on board, because through the media, they convinced the public at large that this was a good thing. And you had the Japanese walking out of the League of Nations saying, well, this is, this is not autocracy, autonomic. I've only got the psychological word in my head. But yeah, this is a new kind of diplomacy, and they're walking out of the League of Nations. So, yeah.
There was this idea to put Japan firmly in the driver's seat and almost reinvent the nation.
Autonomous diplomacy. There, it's just come to me.
Autonomous diplomacy.
That's what they called it.
Sounds like a punk album.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Rancid autonomous diplomacy.
But yeah, that's how they got into Manchuria, and that's how they kept it. And so then, of course, they set up Unit 731.
Well, that's the thing. They saw an opportunity when they took over Manchuria.
Yeah.
And yeah, you spoke about getting the public on side and all that kind of stuff, but one of the primary people but one of the first institutions they had to get on side was the military.
Well, it was the military that did it. The military were the people that...
Well, they got really behind a particular guy. And good old Shiro Ishii.
Right.
I say good old.
Shiro Ishii.
But he pretty much became popular with the army because he created it was effectively a machine that would purify water on the front lines. And they got used to lugging that around, so he helped in a lot of military avenues primarily. But absolutely, like when they took Manchuria, they saw the opportunity to begin doing some real research into what would make Japan super dominant. And a lot of this would be human experimentation. I've just got to make a little note here that what I'm going to say here really is just the tip of the iceberg. I am just really scratching the surface.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of stuff was done. But just to tell you about who this Ishii guy was, to begin with. So it's called kind of the Manchuria incident. It's kind of known as.
Incident.
The incident. Well, it depends where you are. I think it's the Manchuria incident if you're in Japan now.
Yeah.
it may have another name in China. But
the
this
genocide.
Yep. But this was the taking of Manchuria by Japan in 1931. And Ishii himself was the founder of these Japanese human experimentation facilities. He wanted to develop basically biological weapons for military prestige. He wanted the Japanese army to be one of the most formidable, one of the scariest, just one of the best all over. And he got back in for the military because of this water purification system. So he set up this, what was called the Epidemic Prevention Laboratory. This would serve as the HQ for his experimentations. This effectively was Unit 731.
Yeah.
And then they also built another unit very close to Manchuria called the Togo unit. Across all the units in this time, Ishii was in charge of about 10,000 people. That's how many people he controlled. He used prisoners of war, he used Soviets, he used Mongolians, he used Koreans, and he obviously used Chinese, lots of Chinese. And between the years of 1940 and 45, he tortured and killed about 3,000 people. And that's just in the period from 1940 to 45. That doesn't take into account all the people who died before 1940.
Yeah.
But the first facility that he built was rubbish.
Okay.
It didn't work. 16 people, they revolted and they escaped.
Oh, yes.
So what they did is they built another prison, but it was a prison within a prison. So there was like a main building, and then they built another building around the outside of it. And this was in Pingfang, an area also close to Manchuria. So what were they doing in there? There's basically all kinds of the worst kinds of stuff. like what you don't ever want to happen to you happened in there. There were vivisections happened. Basically, a vivisection is opening people up while they're still alive to see what's going on in there. And you do that because you might have injected them with ground up mites to see if you can give them hemorrhage. And pass on fevers and things like that. But there were basically appendectomies. There were tracheotomies, where a tracheostomy is where you open someone's throat and you stick a pipe in it and you try and get them to breathe through the pipe. If anyone's seen that movie, Three Kings, that happens in that. Mark Wahlberg gets like shot and there's a build-up where he can't breathe. So they
see it quite a lot in films.
Yeah. They have to cut a little pipe in there and they have to release the pressure all the time. So that's a tracheostomy. So they did that. As I said, appendectomies. They shot them. They cut their arms open and sewed them back up. And this was all under the guise of like frontline medical care. So what they were doing, they were like, oh yeah, we're training medical doctors for the front lines to make sure that they could deal with this kind of stuff.
I mean, actually, if you think about the attitude that they had towards what we would today call participants, at the time you called them subjects, I guess.
Yeah.
They told the locals around the factory, you would say, or the prison, that it was a lumber mill. And they called the subjects logs because you can burn or cut a log up. That's simply how they understood the subjects. They were logs, like a commodity. Completely. And when they needed more, they used the secret police or the police force out in the local towns. They rounded a few people up for no reason and carted them off to the lumber mill, in scare quotes. So that's the kind of attitude they had towards them.
This was it. There was again this higher attitude. We are like what you were talking about. Yeah. But there was loads of there was obviously the physiological studies like cutting people open, like we just said. But there was also pathogenic studies. So they'd be intentionally infecting people with various things. One of these things was epidemic hemorrhage fever.
Okay.
And what they would do is they grind up mites, mix them with a bit of salt water. They'd inject it into the thigh of what they called an ape.
Well, in the literature that they were publishing,
apes. Yeah. So the ape gets a fever, then they take the blood from the ape, they inject the blood into another ape, and then the other ape gets a fever, but that ape starts peeing protein out. The ape apparently became feverish at 39.4 degrees C. And so what they'd do is, when the ape became feverish, they would perform a vivisection. They would open up the ape and have a look at the infected organs. They'd look at the livers, the kidney, the spleen. But the problem was that people did kind of start catching on, because apes don't get feverish at 39.4 degrees.
And when you say people started catching on, that's the international community.
Yeah.
They're giving lectures and publishing articles.
Yeah, they're telling people about their findings. They're just not being very specific about how they're finding these findings.
Yeah, and on what?
Exactly. But people do catch on because apes do not become feverish at 39.4 degrees, but humans do. And that's one of the things that really, really let people on. They did experiments in, obviously, plague. They'd infect people with plague. They'd give people frostbite. But going back to the plague, so really kind of jumping ahead a little bit, because this was going on for a number of years, and obviously I can't go into everything, but all the tests they did, plague, frostbite, going into plague, this is actually a statement from somebody who worked in that unit. And what he said for plague, and this is a quote from him, from his writings in 2004, a guy called Yoshio Shinazuka, and what he said was first we collected blood from them and measured their immunity. On the next day, we injected 4 kinds of plague vaccines into 4 of the subjects. No vaccine was given to one subject as a control. A week later, vaccines were given again. A month later, we injected 1 cc liquid with the same number of plague germs in every subject. All 5 were infected with plague. The man that had no vaccine was infected first. 2 or 3 days later, he became feverish and pale. On the next day, he was dying and his face grew darker. He was still alive, but the members of the special division, which administered the special prison of Maruta, logs,
okay.
That's Maruta, that's what Maruta means.
Okay.
Brought him naked on the stretcher to the dissection room where we awaited him. Lieutenant Hosoda articulated his heartbeat on his chest, so he's basically waiting until it's a decent pace.
Okay.
And at the moment the circulation finished, it was like, let's begin. So that would be when they cut them open and have a look for plague. That's when the vivisection would take place.
Wow.
In terms of frostbite, this is a statement from the Sergeant Major of Police. Sorry. Yeah. This is a statement from the Sergeant Major of Police, a guy called Satoru Kurikazu. He said, I saw experiments performed on living people for the first time in December 1940. I was shown these experiments by researcher Yoshimura, a member of the 1st Division. He was another doctor that got kind of involved in these experiments. These experiments were first performed in the prison laboratory. When I walked into the prison laboratory, 5 Chinese experimentees were sitting on a long-form bench. 2 of them, Chinese, had no fingers at all. Their hands were black. In those of 3 others, the bones were visible. They had fingers, but they were only bones. Yoshimura told me that this was the result of freezing experiments. And what they'd do was that they'd dip a finger in ice-cold water for 30 minutes.
Jesus.
And just kind of see what happens, just to determine the skin temperature, etc. But this guy, Yoshimura, who was doing these particular frostbite experiments, after the war, he became a professor at the School of Medicine. He was given an Order of the Rising Sun 3rd class for his work in environmental adaptation science.
Of course he was.
So that is really skimming over some of the things that went in. But there was plague, vivisections, frostbite experiments, just torture of thousands and thousands of people.
Well, one of the things that Shiro Ishii really wanted was to be essentially known as the granddaddy of chemical warfare.
That's right.
So that's what a lot of this was also targeted at. So I mean, when you talk about the plague as well, of course, they were essentially trying to work out how they could use it as a biological weapon. So they started loading up where on planes you would have places to drop missiles on the wings. They were loading them up with boxes full of fleas that were infected with the plague, and they would just go out into the local population. They'd go out, drop them. They would drop them over. There was a few different villages they would drop them over, but I think there was one. Because the thing is, there's still testimonies out there about this. You can watch documentaries about this, and you can see. There's even one documentary where the bomber himself, and we'll come on to why he hasn't been hung. The bomber himself is on this documentary talking about it, and many of the doctors, and they would drop these fleas over the village, and to see how effective that was, they donned these great white outfits, a bit like the KKK they looked like, but with these gas masks, and they marched into the nearest village, or into this village rather, maybe a week later, and there's actually a picture of them. You can see them coming over the fields. It's honestly like a horror film. They march into the village, grab people, drag them out into the fields, and just cut them open, just to see what happened to their organs, just to make sure they definitely had the plague. So they were cutting people open in the fields.
After dropping these fleas on them.
Yeah,
this
like a week
roving
beforehand.
band of people would just come and cut
And
people
cut them open,
in
yeah.
the field.
Yeah, in the field. They just drag them out into the nearest field and they'd cut them open.
And then what, just leave them there?
Yeah, absolutely. And they were trying to develop the plague, essentially, as a biological weapon for use against the US. So there was at one point they sent a load of balloons over with firebombs on them over to the US.
Yeah, that's right. They drifted. They used the wind, effectively. And they had sandbags, didn't they? And what would happen is, because the helium in the balloons would obviously dissipate over time, they would drop sandbags. So the sandbags would be on timers, and they'd drop the sandbags off, and so the balloons would stay elevated periods over time. And that's why you had bombings, like a random... I'm sure I heard that on a podcast, of it, like talking about a random bombing that happened in America somewhere.
Yeah, it might be Minnesota or Mississippi. Or
Yeah.
It begins with an M. There was a place where I think it might even be a church. But yeah, there was these firebombs that were going off, and that was not the initial aim, really. It was just to make sure they could do it. They were then wanting to load that up with plague bombs, essentially, so fleas. That's what they wanted to use against the US.
Oh my
However,
God.
they lost the war before that could take place. Because they found that the most effective way of doing it was loading up ceramic missile shells full of fleas, just, like ceramic pottery almost, and just dropping it. So that's what would have been landing on the US if we hadn't, or if they hadn't rather, used nuclear weaponry. So you sort of say, well, it's terrible what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but good God, the biological warfare that would have taken place anyway, simply from fleas being dropped over the US, would have been horrific.
So insane. To think that you could do that, float a balloon just across the planet.
A plague balloon.
A plague balloon across the planet.
Yeah. Yeah, so when we talk about the the intercontinental ballistic missiles that North Korea is trying to develop, you go, yeah, okay, that's a threat, sure, but they could just load a balloon up with fleas and let it go.
That's you wonder at the kind of mind that could think that up.
Well,
But
they were
then,
thinking national survival is what they were thinking.
That's it. Well, if you talk about national survival, just kind of on an aside point, there was an interesting thing I read recently in a book about primatology, whereby there were some people who were researching a particular tribe. I can't remember which tribe it was. But they took them up in an aeroplane. They'd never seen an aeroplane before, this tribe. And they were like, whoa. And this tribe said, leave the door open. And the pilot was like, no, it's freezing up there. Like, you'll freeze. Because they obviously weren't wearing modern clothing, all that kind of stuff. But they loaded the plane up with rocks. And when the plane was flying over, they chucked the rocks out because a rival tribe was across the way. And the pilot said that he just witnessed bombing in Neolithic man.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow.
They loaded it up with rocks and chucked them out.
The first thing they thought was, we're going into the sky.
Yeah.
Let's make sure we can throw some rocks on our enemies.
Isn't that just bonkers?
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
God, that's really deep set, isn't it?
Yeah.
In us, the violence that's within all of us.
That's it.
So that was the Japanese. And then, of course, there were the Nazis, which our education system, loves to tell us all about. But so we thought we'd start with the Japanese. The Nazis, obviously, really, really went deep and dark. The reason the Japanese, you don't hear so much about them, is actually because MacArthur wanted the research. So MacArthur was the general at the time, or the army general in the US, and he wanted the research, and Shiro Ishii was essentially saying, well, we're going to burn it, so you better give us immunity. And they were given immunity. They were given immunity in secret by MacArthur. The Soviets were not happy about this. The Soviets wanted to prosecute for war crimes and crimes against humanity, but the US said it was a piece of communist propaganda, and nothing had taken place there. Of course, it later came out that it did, but that's why you can watch documentaries. Google it, have a look at the documentaries. The History Channel has a really good one, and people who worked in the prisons, and like I said, the bomber who dropped the fleas, they will talk about it. And there's even one guy. I saw an interview with one guy, and he is saying, he's still very firmly entrenched in the idea that it was a good thing. Everything that took place was a good thing. He was very happy about it all, and they were logs. They're still logs. There's absolutely no empathy. There's no remorse.
Or Maruta.
Yeah. And so these people are still out and free because they were given immunity by the US. Nazis didn't get it so easy.
Unless you went to NASA.
Unless you went to NASA, yeah. Or to Argentina.
Basically helped develop the American space program.
Yeah. Well, this was it. If they could get the research without you, and they had everything they needed, they'd try for war crimes and take the research. But they definitely wanted the research. So the Japanese were quite clever in that way. They said, we're going to burn it. We want immunity. We want this internationally recognized immunity before we hand over anything. The Nazis didn't do that because they obviously lost the war and were taken over, and everyone, we got there first. But so with the Nazis, there was a couple of things that actually paved the road for this. So there was a real focus in German medicine on experimental methods, and this is a little bit what you're talking like what you were talking about earlier with the atheism. It was this move into experimentation, empiricism, experimental methods. So to become a doctor, to become a medical doctor, you had to do a research-based thesis. So you had all these scientists, essentially. They were scientists first, and as it would later come to be discovered, they were really doctors second. The Hippocratic Oath was not front and centre for these people. And around that time...
That being first do no harm.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, first to do no harm.
First do no harm.
And that wasn't even on their list, let alone being first. Because then at the same time you had the eugenics movement, and then you had this racial ideology that got injected into that. There's this idea of hereditarian medicine, and this is actually this is the idea that the doctors should act in the interests of the nation and the race, rather than foremostly the patient. So like you say, first do no harm. The idea of acting for the patient first and foremost was not part of their ideology at the time. And
it was the collective.
Yeah.
It's almost like the Borg.
The Borg?
Have you ever seen Star Trek?
I was more of a Star Wars man myself.
Ah, right. Well, there's this group called the Borg in Star Trek, and basically they're a hybrid robot organic group, but they serve a hive mind.
Okay.
And what they do is they go around the universe assimilating people into the Borg. And that really kind of reminds me of communism a little bit, because like all of your, you just become part of this hive mentality in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting.
You're not a family. There are no families. There's no nothing. There's just serving the higher power, the queen. In a way, it's like a hive again.
Yeah. Well, that's a bit like the Japanese ideology at the time as well.
Serve the emperor.
Serve the emperor, which interestingly they thought was a middle way between democracy and communism.
Serving the emperor.
Serving the emperor.
Who was the emperor? Is that Hirohito at the time?
I believe so. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, before the war, actually, the Nazis did, comparably a lot of good. So they actually they passed laws against animal experimentation, and you had the Lübeck disaster, which was essentially a load of newborns being given a vaccine for TB. And they
the Lübeck tragedy. Yeah.
Yes, and they died because they managed to contaminate the syringe with TB, a live form of TB. So the very thing they were trying to vaccinate them against went into their system. And so there were actually a lot of codes of conduct and things, like I mentioned earlier, that came out at that time. So the Nazis had this regulatory framework, which was world-leading at the time. But just over time, obviously, there was this general Nazification of values that took the most regulated and most advanced bioethical framework in the world and turned it from the best to the worst. It's incredible, really, that they managed it. So this is why it's always really... People always say, you need to be aware of the past so it's not repeated in the future. And it's very easy to turn around and say, well, we're so advanced now, something that backwards could not happen again. No. These people were advanced. These people actually had a lot of the same regulations that we have in place now, but they had an ideology that enabled that to be put to one side. So we need to be really careful.
If you do look at domestic policy, under the Nazi Party, a lot of very positive things were done. Education system, militarization. They wanted educated people.
Sanitation and hygiene.
All of that, not to undo what they did.
But actually it's just worth always stating
I once
it.
met a girl in Austria and I brought that up. She was not happy that I brought that up.
Yeah, but I mean, it's almost like this is actually more of a case against for being cognizant of ourselves, right? Because the fact the Nazis were so bad is a real counterpoint to the fact they did so much good in the first, let's say 5 years, when they first came to power. They did so much good, and it's really important that we are very well aware of that. It's not like they were some Machiavellian moustache-twirling group of people. They were in many ways, but when you look at their domestic policy, they're doing a lot of good. And so when we see ourselves doing a lot of good, we need to always be really, really cognizant of the fact that very easily the tables can turn. Which is why when we look at statism, I mentioned radical statism earlier, when we say, you deal with it, let's use the state to answer all of our problems. Well, that's very dangerous, because that's what was being done here.
This does bring us back to our Brexit episode as well.
It does, yeah. But when we look to the government to say, we want you to enforce all of these laws, to enforce all these equity laws, you say, well, why would you want the government to do that? Because one government from now, you'll have someone like Trump. If you're a Democrat and you want equity laws, well, now you've given all this power to the government, and now it's somebody you don't want. The one thing to be
Hence why America has guns.
Yes. Yeah, one thing to be said for the Western nations, they've done some terrible things which we're going to come on to. But at the very least, it was the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press that then exposed it.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas, unfortunately, Nazi Germany and Japan had to be conquered in order for it to be exposed. So there's terrible people on both sides, because it's human nature. But the political systems, God, the gin. I'm gonna have to stop drinking during these podcasts. Jeez, I mean, actually, a minute ago, I served myself the stronger. You probably saw me trying to dilute it desperately. This gin is so strong.
So it's probably interesting to make a delineation between the Japanese and the Nazis.
Yeah.
Because, there was this kind of superiority with the Japanese, but the primary concern with the Japanese was becoming the most influential, dominant, biogenetic power, like Ishii, like you were saying, about what Ishii wanted to achieve.
So surely were the Nazis.
Yeah, but also the Nazis pretty much put it to exterminating a group of people as well. So
yeah, I mean, the Japanese were doing it simply because it was like, here are some rodents, here are some logs.
Yeah, exactly.
This is really useful for us. We also don't like communists.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Germans decided they were going to
use these communist logs to further our own kind of thing. Whereas the Nazis were slightly different.
Yeah, I mean,
slightly different.
They saw the Aryan race as, like the Uberman, as you said, and they started getting rid of the Jews. They slowly started delicensing Jewish doctors. Then there's also something that's not often talked about. It's the Romani and the Sinti people as well, colloquially referred to as gypsies, of course. About 25 to 60% of their population was wiped out. You had this kind of slow delicensing and the pushing out of Jews from the medical establishment, and many establishments, of course. And then you had the sterilization laws, which initially was only targeting schizophrenics, people with muscular dystrophy. So basically people with disabilities, epileptics, people that they classified as being of severe mental defection.
Get rid of it.
Yeah. Even alcoholism.
God,
I'd be gone. Even people that are alcoholics, they were also gone. So get rid of it. And, an estimate, I think it was 340,000 people were forcibly sterilized in Germany between 1933. 340,000 between 33 and 45. And interestingly, the sterilization law didn't actually specify race as a grounds for sterilization, but ethnic minorities were vulnerable to it being used against them. So you had these mixed race children of black French troops and even Germans who were classified Rhineland bastards when you translate it. And they were between 13 and 16 years old, and they were sterilized. And like I said, the gypsies as well. or the Romanis and the Sintis, to be more precise. But I mean, it was terrible, really, what was going on. Like, for example, there's Eva Justin. Have you heard of Eva Justin?
I have not, no.
So she was essentially influenced by this guy Robert Ritter's work on the primitive nature of the Romani people, or the Roma people, in their eyes, anyway. And they
primitive how?
Primitive, just they believed they were primitive.
Right.
It was just a belief that they had they were primitive, but cognitively and ethically, they were not able to be socialized. That was one of the things they'd say. They were not fit for socialization. So it's not even like they could be bought into. So you could sterilize people, but you can't even bring them into the social world, they believed. But this Eva Justin, she went to an orphanage and she analyzed the psychology of 148, 150 odd children at this Roman Catholic children's home. And at the conclusion of the study, she sent them all to Auschwitz. She studied 150 children and sent them to be murdered at the end. And she got a lifetime award in 1944, I believe. Before the end of the war, she got this lifetime achievement award because the Nazis were so proud of what she'd been up to, proving the primitive nature of the Romani people.
Oh my God.
But
it's
yeah,
like, especially when you've got no real definition for what primitive is other than it.
Not Aryan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because what is primitive? You could describe primitive as if you believe in evolution, you could effectively say that reproduction is primitive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was totally
There's
baseless.
No definitions.
It was
it's
not scientific.
Baseless. It's just nonsense.
It was pure racism, which is basically everything that the Nazis stood for, because they believed that they were superior to other races, which is the definition of racism.
Yeah.
They were a racist state. And
there's an essential difference between you and another human being.
Yeah.
Purely based on
the race.
The race.
Or, where they came from. Interestingly as well, I mean, you had these Jews, like I think Rasha. Rasha was a famous Nazi who did experimentation, and he was a Jew himself. No, Eppinger I'm thinking of. He was a Jew, but he signed up to the Nazi Party in 1933 and got into the SS and whatnot, and he was okay because he was doing terrible enough things that he clearly was loyal to the state. So it wasn't. I mean, clearly they make some disambiguation there. They say, well, we hate Jews and Jews should be exterminated. However, yeah, you're doing terrible enough things to your own people, so we'll let you in. A bit like Fox News when they bring on, the one racist black guy they can find.
Yeah, right.
You know?
There's this one Tory guy, and they always dish him out. They're always like, "Okay, this is a race issue. Just show that we're not racist." And they always put him there,
Yeah.
And this poor man, he has to defend.
Yeah.
Like racism in his party, it's.
Well, you had the same thing in the Nazi Party. However, these Jewish doctors were terribly abusing Jews and Roma people and Sinti people. So yeah, but so then you move into this horrible position where the physician is essentially not serving people; it's a state selector, and it's diagnosing useful life and useless life, which is what you see when you see these films at the camps. You're to the left or you're to the right when you're lining up and being selected. And that's interestingly what Mengele, the guy, one of the most famous, Joseph Mengele, he was one of the most famous experimenters of the Nazi world. That was his primary job. His day job was selection. It was to the left or to the right. Are you useful? Are you useless? And that's the diagnosis. Imagine going to the GP and hearing, a diagnosis of useless. It's incredible. It's incredible. But that's what they were doing. And so initially, I spoke a minute ago about sterilization. That's what they were really interested in researching initially. So, for example, one of the best methods they found for women was they would take formalin. So, do you know formaldehyde?
Yes.
Formaldehyde, for anyone that doesn't know, is essentially a preservative. It's used for all sorts of things, even for like making car doors, and it's used for all sorts of things in photography. But in my school, actually, when I was younger, we had formaldehyde that was preserving some kind of body parts.
Mm-hmm.
You see like brains floating in it. And the vat broke. And they evacuated the entire school because I mean it is carcinogenic. It is a human carcinogen that causes cancer. It's really, really bad for you. You shouldn't inhale it. They were taking formalin, which is essentially 40% formaldehyde and 60% something else, either water. Sometimes there's methanol and all sorts of other shit in there as well. They would take that formalin. So it's not even, they would take formalin and they would inject it into women's ovaries. That was one very effective method they found. And yeah, horrific, right? And then for many of these people, while they're researching them, they would then cut out the ovaries just to make sure that they'd done the required damage. Because, of course, they wanted to roll this out on a wider basis.
To just make sure.
Yeah, just to make sure when they're researching it, they were then cutting the ovaries out afterwards. And they were also using X-rays to burn the ovaries and then, of course, cutting them out as well. And they did the same thing with men. So, for example, the penis and testicles were subject to radiation for about 15 minutes, and 2 weeks later, they removed both of the testicles for examination. Of course, no consent was given. That was sterilization. I mean, imagine that. You go to the doctors for a routine checkup, and then they are saying, oh, this is one of the things they were saying as well, The Germans were very, very focused on efficiency. I mean, that's, of course, the general kind of discriminatory joke that's made about that's a stereotype of Germans now. And it probably comes from the fact that that's what the Nazis, in terms of those jokes, come from the fact that that's what the Nazis were focused on. They were focused on efficiency. Efficiency of sterilization, efficiency of killing. So if you come on to methods of killing, you say, well, they were really essentially focused on how efficiently could you kill someone? What's the best method? Because anything that doesn't kill someone 100% of the time, we need something better. So, for example, they were trying alkaloid poisons. So there was this one case that's documented where they had 4 Russian prisoners, and these German doctors, I mean doctor seems like the wrong word, stood behind a curtain. They poisoned their food with this poison, and they observed the reaction of the prisoners. It's said in the documentation that some of them died. There's only 4, so let's just say 2 of them died. They then killed the other 2 and performed an autopsy. Right? And, I mean, normally autopsies are performed to find out why someone died. In this case, they knew why they died. They shot them. They were trying to find out why they survived the poison. So you had poisonings. They're not
doctors. They're executioners.
They are executioners.
They're just executioners, and it's the creativity with which you can execute someone.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And, yeah.
I mean, the cyanide tablets that you see in films.
Absolutely.
People bite down
you
on them.
down, foams up. It shuts down all your systems. Yeah.
Yeah, the Nazis developed that, which Himmler, the head of the SS, eventually then used himself.
They say Hitler took that too. He just bashed down on a cyanide tablet inside that bunker.
Yeah, and of course you go, well, if they developed it, they sure as hell
tried it
on a load of others as well, a load of Jews and whatnot. This is particularly bad. In studying septicemia, so poisoned blood essentially, they took pus containing strep, which is like a bacterial
streptococcal.
Which you find on your skin all the time, but you can get infections as a result of it. They took pus with strep in it, and they injected it into the inner thigh. When an abscess developed, they then extracted it and injected it intravenously into the bloodstream. And this was done almost exclusively to Roman Catholic priests. So
they create a streptococcal cyst, really?
Yeah.
And drain it.
And then they put
intravenously inject it.
Straight into your bloodstream. They, in the documentation, they said it didn't invariably cause death, therefore it was considered inefficient. So, on to the next method.
The immune system was presumably better at combating it than the
Nazis would have hoped.
Yeah.
They found one particularly good method was repeatedly injecting tuberculosis into the bloodstream. That was apparently quite effective, as you can imagine. But they found the most efficient form of medical execution was the use of intracardiac phenol or benzene. I mean, phenol is essentially a paint stripper. It's really toxic stuff. And they were using this, they were just basically pumping it into people. And they were killing about 30 to 60 people a day just by pumping this into their bloodstream.
Because what would their eventual plan be? Right, okay, we're just going to round everybody up into a camp and just inject them like we line up cows in an abattoir and just shoot them in the head.
Yeah.
It's just, that's what they were going to do.
Yeah. Yeah, you sort of think, well, why can't you shoot them?
Yeah, right. That's what I mean. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
you know, since the Dark Ages, we've been. That's why I said executioner. It's just we've been chopping people's heads off for ages. It works perfectly well.
Yeah. It's
Like-
just pure sick, sadistic creativity.
Yeah, that's what it is, isn't it?
You know, even poison bullets they were experimenting with. They'd hand select a few prisoners and they'd shoot them in the upper thigh with a poison bullet just to see what happened.
Just in case, like,
Just
the
in
bullet
case.
didn't work on its own.
Yeah. I mean, even mustard gas. They were injecting liquid mustard, or mustard gas, liquid equivalent. They were getting people to inhale it. They were getting people to have it rubbed onto their skin or you know, wounds exposed to it. There were all sorts of horrible mustard gas experiments. They were just constantly looking for ways of killing people. I mean, they even experimented with malaria and typhus as well. You know, like the Japanese, they were looking at biological
Absolutely.
weaponry as well.
Pathogenic warfare.
All with the word efficiency tacked onto it. So yeah, and then of course there were, you know, the regenerative and transplantation experiments that were done. So you had these healthy Polish prisoners that were selected, and a lot of them were young Polish girls. And
They didn't try to put monkey parts into them, did they? Like the Russians
Well,
did
there
for
was that.
rejuvenation.
There was that as well, yeah. But even just the basic, like, regenerative studies sound grim. They would take both of their legs, break all of the bones in their legs into several pieces with a hammer, and then they'd join them, sometimes even without clips. They wouldn't necessarily join them. Sometimes they were joined with clips and splints and put into plaster casts. Sometimes entire parts of their fibula, like their shin bone, were taken out. Tibia, were taken out.
And
It
what were they
was-
looking for? If we break the tibia, how long does it take to
Yeah.
rejuvenate under certain conditions?
Yeah.
So it rejuvenates, yes or no, in a plaster cast, a splint,
Yeah.
all these various things.
Pretty much. They were like, you know what, we've got, like the Japanese would say, logs. We've got just human subjects that we can use here. They were taking entire limbs. They were taking from the shoulder, the arms, or sometimes the legs, and you know, they're putting them in these sterile, moist dressings and sending them off to a hospital nearby. And apparently, it was a futile attempt at transplantation. It was essentially just a great big waste. And these then donor prisoners were just killed with a lethal injection.
So it didn't work.
Didn't work.
Put them down.
No, exactly.
Hideous.
A lot of what was happening as well, a lot of these studies were really badly designed. You think of German efficiency as the stereotype we mentioned a minute ago. You think of German science being great, and hence the NASA program, etc. And there's many famous German scientists, but a lot of the research that was going on here was really badly designed. Not like the Japanese research, which apparently, despite its inherent evil and nastiness, was quite well designed in some cases. Most of the Nazi research was not.
So at least the Japanese were controlling in some way for various
At
conditions.
least,
There was a
yeah.
some kind of scientific method there, but with the Nazis, they're just
Well, there was an attempt at scientific method, but they were just doing it badly. You know, so they would have control groups in many cases, but yeah, it was just badly designed. So there's a lot of stuff online, a lot of these articles you can find where they talk through the design of the research and why it's inherently flawed, and why essentially the research tells you nothing. A lot of it, some of it told them, you know, something. And the U.S. Air Force and the Royal Air Force in the UK took that research. Actually, I'll come on to that in a minute, with the altitude sickness, or the altitude effects. But there was a bit more that was done to aid the military specifically. So we talked about sterilization and methods of killing, you know, in a sort of general sense, but they were also doing a lot of research to help the military, as you'd imagine. So the main cause of death on the battlefield was hemorrhage, so blood loss, obviously. You know, you get your arm blown off, blood loss. So that's the main cause of death. It's actually not being shot through the head and you're instantly dead. It's the blood loss. So they were really interested in stopping that.
I imagine it would have been quite hard to get a headshot with the technology, with the kind of weaponry they had. You know,
Yeah.
from 100 yards away with a 2.2 rifle, how often are you going to get a headshot? You know, if you're not a sniper, you're more likely to be blown up. You're more likely to have these kind of appendage problems, like bleeding out, like an arm flying off, or
Yeah.
like the field experiments that the Japanese were doing, cutting people up and sewing them back up, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And it was the blood loss that was the main cause of death. But this Sigmund Rascher, I mentioned him a little bit earlier on when I was thinking of Eppinger. Rascher, he's the guy that we all know as the guy who loved human leather. So when you watch some of these old films, you'll see lampshades in the Nazi cabins, lampshades made out of human skin. Well, this is the guy that popularised that. So this Sigmund Rascher, he was a surgeon, and he was involved in a lot of the experiments I'm about to come on to. But he promoted, in this case, polygal. So he was hugely into polygal, but and this was essentially a pectin-based substance that he believed would stop bleeding. Right, so he had, in his eyes, the answer to hemorrhaging. He's also the guy who was selling off human handbags and stuff like this. So
making wallets in his spare time.
Yeah, and selling it to his colleagues. So a real sicko.
There's another person who did that. He was called Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah.
He was a serial killer. He used to chase people down, kill them, make lampshades.
Yeah. Well, this guy's essentially Dahmer, but with institutional backing. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's yeah. I mean, well, if you can see Andy's face, he's not smiling. It's kind of like just exclamation of wow.
Ugh.
Anyway. That's why we're not having video.
Yeah.
I mean, you're sort of face palming here, but yeah. So what he was doing was they were simulating combat wounds by just amputating the extremities, amputating arms, fingers, legs, just the amputating all sorts of things without anaesthetic, because of course that causes vasoconstriction. You know, your arteries and veins start to. So they did it without anaesthetic because of the adrenaline and all the effects that has. They were shooting them through the neck in some cases, through the chest, just to see whether this polygal worked. And the real thing at the time, the US or the West, they had penicillin. It was discovered. It was used on the battlefield, and Rascher saw polygal as a potential alternative. He said, yeah, well, we've got a German equivalent. It wasn't a German equivalent, but they were opening people up, trying to demonstrate that it could do the same things as penicillin, just killing people left, right, and centre, because he was trying to show that was an antibiotic, and it really was not. It didn't do anything.
This is another example of the bad science.
Bad science.
Actual thing exists. It's called penicillin. It's proven. It's used on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Like, why do you need to do these experiments?
He simply started from, I want this to work, and I'm going to work backwards and prove it, as opposed to saying this could work. Let's see if that's the case. The scientific method was thrown out the window for this man.
He's trying to launder.
Yes.
He's trying to launder into his research.
Well, he was later tried and found guilty of faking his research by Himmler.
Himmler?
Yeah. Well, that's his downfall, because he claimed to have 3 children, right? And he had I think a wife who was quite much older than him, but she was 48 when she was apparently bearing her 4th child. And he wanted to show that you could bear children into your older age, because that would then help proliferate and extend the Aryan race. So he was trying to show you could extend the childbearing age. Well, the childbearing age.
The childbearing age, yeah.
Yeah, and so he was claiming he had 3 kids. He had a 4th on the way. But during the wife's 4th pregnancy, this guy Rascher was arrested for trying to kidnap an infant. And it was found that all 3 of his kids were kidnapped or bought, which, I mean, it's much for muchness, isn't it? And Himmler felt personally insulted, because this guy Rascher was very close to Himmler, and Himmler was reporting all of his research to Hitler himself, and he felt personally insulted, and he tried him for, kidnapping infants.
How dare you make a fool of me, almost.
Yeah, and they found scientific fraud, all of these things, and he and his wife were executed. So, I mean, a little bit of justice in a weird way, but it's based.
What did his wife do?
I don't know. She was just involved, wasn't she? She knew they weren't.
Married the guy.
Well, no, she knew she wasn't pumping out Aryan children. She knew she wasn't pregnant. She was part of the whole conspiracy. She was part of the abductions. So, not a top-notch person herself.
Yeah,
to be fair. But so he was doing these hemorrhaging trials, also altitude effects. So the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, they essentially donated this pressure chamber. And what they were doing, they were giving people oxygen masks. I say people. They were giving Jews oxygen masks in the pressure chamber, changing the pressure, the atmospheric pressure in the chamber, up to something at least 14,000 feet. I've seen a few different studies. They sometimes say 60,000, which is very, very high.
That's double what a standard plane flies.
Yes.
You fly at 30,000 feet.
Yeah, exactly. But the reason this was important to the Germans was because the Allied planes could get higher. They could reach higher altitudes. And so it was really important to them to find out the effects of altitude. And then also these German pilots, when they were ejecting, the effect of
As
suddenly,
they fell.
yes,
Right, coming
and
down,
parachuted.
yeah.
So they were increasing the pressure in the chambers to simulate a parachute descent. And very often they were getting these air embolisms, so they were getting these pockets of air in their brain, and all sorts of terrible things were taking place. And sometimes they were even drowning them afterwards to simulate falling into the sea, because that was very common. They were over water when they ejected. And, these people were terribly, terribly, let's say, injured by this pressure chamber. And then there was a vivisection. They were dissected, right? So their chests were opened up, their brains and heads were opened up. And in some cases, their hearts were still beating when this happened. This is the sorts of things that Russia was involved in. Also, like you said with the Japanese...
Hannibal Lecter.
It's
This
Hannibal
is like
Lecter.
what Hannibal Lecter does.
Yeah. Just, people that are still alive, just opening their heads up. I mean, hypothermia, you mentioned that with the fingers. Hypothermia,
frostbite, yeah.
They did 400 experiments on about 280 to 300 subjects. 89 of them died, so it's surprising considering what I'm about to tell you they did. But the aim was to find the most effective way of rewarming these pilots who parachuted into the sea, like I said.
So make them really cold and then see if we can warm them up and save them, yeah.
Exactly. And so the victims, which is, I think, the most appropriate term, not even subjects, and certainly not participants.
They are victims.
The victims...
100% victims.
Absolutely. They were forced to remain in a tank of iced water for about 3 hours at a time. There was an interesting finding which the UK and the US were very interested in getting their hands on in terms of the documentation, which was that it's only when the back of the neck was submerged in the ice cold water that fatalities took place. So there were certain life jackets that you could wear, and that they did wear when they were testing it, that either did or did not cover the back of the neck. And of course, when the back of the neck is in ice cold water, it basically cools the brainstem, the part at the bottom of your brain, as you know. But for anyone listening, the part at the bottom of your brain that is essentially the earliest and most fundamental part of your brain, the part that when that thing shuts down, you are defined as being dead. That thing, when that cools down, because of the back of your neck, the occiput, when that's cooled down, you're dead. So
this is
that
about
was
being
a finding.
brain dead. All your
Brain
autonomic stuff, like the stuff you can't feel, like your internal organs, they might all still be ticking over. But being clinically dead is when your brain is dead, and all your organs might still be working, just autonomically. But to be brain dead is death, effectively. Death, the conscious thing. And it's interesting they say at the back of the neck. Wear a scarf. Why do we wear scarves?
Yeah. But that's what they found. And, they had other people that were standing. I mean, actually...
Just interestingly, just as an anecdote.
Yeah, no.
In cinema, you might have seen Pulp Fiction.
Of course.
Yeah. So when you first see Marcellus Wallace, you remember Marcellus Wallace?
Mm-hmm.
The first time you see him, it's the shot of Bruce Willis is there, and the back of Marcellus Wallace's head.
Okay.
And on the back of his neck is a plaster. And that's why Marcellus Wallace is trying to get his briefcase back, because in his briefcase is his soul. And in mythology, you take the soul from the back of the neck.
Yeah,
and that's why they open the briefcase, and it's beautiful, it's beautiful. He's trying to get his soul back, and that's why there's a plaster at the back of the neck. So that's very, very interesting. That if you freeze that,
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, the back of your neck, very important. Wear a scarf, everybody,
Wear
when
a
you go out.
scarf. Or at least a snood, ladies and gentlemen, please.
Yeah, I mean, we're laughing, but these are people that sort of died
trying
in
to
a
make
tank
light,
of...
just
I mean, people that died in tanks of ice cold water. Interestingly, there was one case where they disputed the evidence in the documentation after the war, because they said these two Russians, they were still apparently talking to each other in two ice cold baths of water after 3 hours, and physicians were like, that's not possible. Like, within 10 minutes, you ain't making any noises. You ain't talking to anyone. But apparently after 3 hours, they were still chatting. But I was like, if I can believe anyone was having a conversation after 3 hours in ice cold water, it's the Russians. hardy people. But
plunge pool. It's
yeah.
a plunge pool, yeah.
Yeah, but so it wasn't just the Jews. They were also using prisoners of war and whatnot. The Russians took a bit of a beating in these particular studies. And they were also standing people outside as well. I mean, there was one piece of documentation where 30 people were forced to stand naked in open air in the winter for 9 to 14 hours in temperatures below freezing, of course. And they were trying different methods. They took 4 gypsy women and used body warmth and found that was very ineffective.
Just huddled them up.
Just huddled them up around them. And they felt that...
like penguins.
Yeah, like penguins. And they found the best method was a hot bath. So, they were putting people from ice-cold situations into hot baths. So they were finding out things that were useful for them, but at what cost? And some of the ones you'll really see is the Dachau seawater experiments. You can Google this. This is one of the very famous ones. They were essentially just making people drink seawater until they died, and found out the bloody obvious. They had 4 conditions. They were basically given shipwreck rations, and there were 4 groups. One had no water. Obviously, they died. It's not even worth
it's not even worth having that in the experiment.
No, it's like we know that control condition is death. There's no water.
It's the same like why stand people naked outside in freezing cold? Like you know what's going to happen.
Yeah. Ordinary seawater. Seawater processed by the Birker method, which is essentially just putting a certain chemical, which did absolutely nothing with the water. It was almost meant to be a way of making seawater digestible.
Right.
And that was one that was essentially promoted by this Russia. Didn't work. And then seawater treated to remove the salt, the Schaefer method.
Desalinization.
Desalinization. And it was known that this was they knew that taking the salt out made it drinkable. So nothing was found out from this study. No discoveries were made. They basically just found that damage to the kidney occurred after 6 days and death after 12. That's what they found out. But there was no discoveries as to what you could and couldn't have. That's what was going on.
Little. It's like you could probably say to someone, right, you might get 3 days of extra life should you crash land on a desert island and have some salt water. You might be able to get 3 days out of it before you die from drinking.
That's what they did find. They said some salt water is better than no water. So, I guess that's a useful reason to have that control, but at the expense of people dying.
Yeah. A substantial amount of people dying.
Yeah. So, But that all then predates Joseph Mengele. Joseph Mengele is the guy that you will see in the films. This is the person that's really well documented. He's the guy that collected twins in Auschwitz. So when there were selections taking place, it was good to be a twin. Well, good in scare quotes. You weren't sent straight to the chambers. They would experiment on you first. So he'd go, and the officers would go and collect twins. This Mengele, he was an anthropologist who then became a medical doctor, and he got the Iron Cross twice. The second time was for pulling his colleagues out of a burning tank. So, by all accounts, he sounds like a better guy than Shiro Ishii, but what he then goes on to do is just absolutely horrific. In 1943, so just before the end of the war, he's sent to Auschwitz, and there's Birkenau nearby as well, which is where there was way more gas chambers and crematoriums. But his primary duties were sanitation. It was making sure people didn't get infected. It was making sure that they selected the right useful people. So basically a racist selector. And there's something you can see online. It went viral, a few months ago. But this Eva Moses Core, she did this. There's a video of her. She gives us this account, but there's also written accounts. She was one of the twins. And essentially what it was is that Mengele, he used to train under somebody, he was an assistant to a researcher who was really interested in twins and genetics. And Mengele saw this as a way of engineering, like you've said already. It's just a way of engineering an Aryan, like the Russians were interested in doing, like the Japanese were interested in maintaining. Mengele saw this as a way of engineering or learning how to engineer Aryans.
And with the twins, were twins specifically selected because at that time it was believed these are identical copies of one person, so we've got a couple of...
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there was other things as well. You know, some non-identical twins were also selected, so you could claim that two siblings were twins, non-identical twins. But yes, that was one of the main reasons. And they would do all sorts of sick experiments, like injecting dyes into their irises to see if they could change their eye color, all this sort of thing. Totally
because you need to do that, don't you? You need to do that when you're taking over the world. You need to make sure that you can change people's eye colours to blue and their skin colour to white and their hair to blonde. And
it's just the worst form of racism. Can we change people's eye colour? And they were trialling this on twins. You know, two twins. Do they change their eye colour back to... It's horrific. And I'm just going to quickly read some quotes from Eva Moses Corr's testimony. And the first quote is really about bioethics. She said, "No one ever attempted to explain anything to us. No one explained why we were in Mengele's laboratory, what was going to be done to us, or what would be our ultimate destiny. There was never an attempt to minimize our risks. In fact, we were there for one reason, to be used as experimental objects and then to be killed. Mengele had two types of research programs. One set of experiments dealt with genetics and the other with germ warfare. In the germ experiments, Mengele would inject one twin with the germ, then, if and when that twin died, he would kill the other twin in order to compare the organs at autopsy." That's one quote. Another quote, she says, "One of the twins, who was 19 years old, told of experiments involving a set of teenage boys and teenage girls. Cross transfusions were carried out in an attempt to make boys into girls and girls into boys. Some of the boys were castrated. Transfusion reactions were similarly studied in adolescent twins." And then another quote, and this is just about Mengele's general interests. She says, "In the area of genetics, Mengele collected dwarfs, giants, hunchbacks, and people with abnormalities and defects. He studied genetic traits in the hope of purifying the Aryan super race. He closely monitored eyes and hair colour." End quote. And I should say, obviously, those terms now are not in use, but that was sort of a direct quote of Eva at the time.
Absolutely.
And a couple more quotes. This to me, this really shows how evil this man was and how unnecessary this was. Quote, "A set of gypsy twins was brought back from Mengele's lab after they were sewn back to back. Mengele had attempted to create a Siamese twin by connecting blood vessels and organs. The twins screamed day and night until gangrene set in, and after 3 days they died. Mengele also attempted to connect the urinary tract of a 7-year-old girl to her own colon. Many experiments were performed on the male and female genitals."
It's the human centipede.
Yes.
It's so ridiculous. It's
yes.
like... I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it. That guy is a sick fuck.
Yes.
He is a sick fuck.
Yeah.
There's no other words for him.
It was his side hustle as well. This wasn't even something that was from above. It wasn't dictated to him by Himmler. I mean, Himmler enjoyed hearing about the results, but this wasn't his day job.
It was his initiative,
It was his hobby.
On his own time, yeah.
Yes, on his own time. Very well resourced to do this hobby, but it was a hobby. It was an interest. He was, like you say, a sick fuck. And, to round off this part about the Nazis, it's just the last quote from Eva really puts a finer point on the Japanese, the Nazis, the Russians, everything we've spoken about. She says, "The scientists of the world must remember that the research is being done for the sake of mankind and not for the sake of science. Scientists must never detach themselves from the humans they serve."
Thanks for listening to Abstracts. Music, as always, was Coffee by Cambo. The track's available on the Free Music Archive, link in the description. All references for this episode are available at our website, so for those and to get in touch, head over to abstractspodcast.com. That's abstractspodcast.com. Don't forget to tune in to part 2 of this episode and catch you in a bit.